My daughter-in-law said in front of the whole family, "When the old woman dies, we'll sell everything and travel to Europe." My son laughed and agreed. The next day the lawyer called. "Was the change in the will intentional?" I smiled. "Yes." Their reaction was pure despair. "Listen to my story until the end and comment from which city you're watching me. That way, I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, and I am 83 years old." Everything started on what seemed like an ordinary Thursday evening in late October, when the autumn leaves were painting the world in shades of gold and crimson, much like the fire that was about to ignite within my very soul. I had been living in the family estate for over 50 years, ever since my dear husband Charles passed away. The house had been in our family for 3 generations, filled with memories, antiques, and secrets that only walls could tell. My son Robert, now 45, had been visiting more frequently lately with his wife Sarah, a woman I had never quite warmed to, despite my best efforts to maintain family harmony. That particular evening, I had prepared a feast for the entire family. Robert and Sarah had brought their 2 teenage children, Emma and Michael, along with Sarah's sister Jessica and her husband David. It was supposed to be a celebration of Robert's recent promotion at the law firm, where he worked as a senior partner. The dining room was elegantly set with my finest china, the crystal glasses that Charles had given me for our 25th anniversary, and the silverware that had been passed down through generations. As we gathered around the mahogany dining table, the conversation flowed as smoothly as the expensive wine Robert had brought. The children were chatting about their school activities. Jessica was sharing amusing stories about her recent vacation, and David was discussing his latest business venture. I felt content, surrounded by family, believing that despite our differences, we were united by love and respect. But then, as dessert was being served, something shifted in the atmosphere. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet during most of the evening, suddenly leaned back in her chair with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had consumed more wine than usual, and her cheeks were flushed with a boldness that alcohol often brings. "You know," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the table with an unsettling confidence, "I was talking to my friend Patricia the other day, and she mentioned how her mother-in-law had left them the most beautiful house in the countryside." I noticed Robert glance at his wife with what appeared to be a warning look, but Sarah continued undeterred. "Patricia and her husband are planning the most amazing European tour now that they've sold the property. 3 months in Italy, France, and Spain. Can you imagine? All that history, all that culture, all that wine." The conversation took an uncomfortable turn as Sarah's voice grew louder and more animated. Emma and Michael exchanged glances, clearly sensing the tension that was building. Jessica tried to change the subject by asking about my garden, but Sarah was not to be deterred. "You know what I told Patricia?" Sarah continued, her eyes now fixed directly on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "I told her that when the old woman finally kicks the bucket, Robert and I are going to sell everything and travel to Europe too. We've already looked at some amazing packages. Tuscany, the French Riviera, maybe even a river cruise down the Rhine." The silence that followed was deafening. The clinking of silverware stopped, and even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause its eternal ticking. I felt as though someone had poured ice water directly into my veins, yet somehow I maintained my composure, my face betraying nothing of the storm that was raging within me. But what happened next was perhaps even more devastating than Sarah's callous words. Robert, my own flesh and blood, the child I had nursed through countless illnesses, supported through college, and helped establish in his career, began to laugh. Not a nervous chuckle or an uncomfortable giggle, but a hearty, genuine laugh that suggested he found his wife's statement not only acceptable, but amusing. "Oh, Sarah," Robert said between chuckles, "you're terrible, but honestly, Mom, she's not wrong. This place is worth a fortune, and we could really live it up for a few years with that kind of money." I watched in horror as my son continued to laugh, as if discussing my death and the liquidation of my life's work, was nothing more than casual dinner conversation. Emma looked mortified and excused herself from the table, while Michael stared down at his dessert plate, clearly uncomfortable. Jessica and David appeared frozen, uncertain how to respond to such an inappropriate display. "Robert," I finally managed to say, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside me, "perhaps we should discuss this another time." "Oh, come on, Mom," Robert replied, still grinning. "It's not like it's a secret that this place will be ours someday. Sarah's just being practical about it." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, apparently encouraged by her husband's support. "Exactly. And honestly, Margaret, you should be happy knowing that we'll put the money to good use instead of just letting it sit in some bank account gathering dust." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of forced pleasantries and strained conversations. I played the role of the gracious hostess, serving coffee and engaging in small talk, but inside I was fundamentally changed. As the family prepared to leave, Robert kissed my cheek and told me he loved me, words that now felt hollow and meaningless. After everyone had gone, I sat in my favorite armchair by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers and reflecting on what I had witnessed. For 50 years, I had been the matriarch of this family, the keeper of traditions, the source of stability and support. I had helped Robert through his difficult divorce from his first wife, had welcomed Sarah into the family despite my reservations, and had always been generous with my time, money, and love. But in that moment, I realized that to them, I was nothing more than an obstacle standing between them and their dreams of European adventures. They saw me not as a person deserving of respect and dignity, but as an inconvenience whose departure would solve their financial problems and fulfill their travel fantasies. I spent the entire night awake, pacing through the rooms of my beloved home, remembering all the moments that had shaped my life within these walls. The nursery, where Robert had taken his first steps, the kitchen where Charles had proposed to me over breakfast, the garden where we had hosted countless family gatherings, the library where I had spent countless hours reading and writing in my journals. By morning, I had made a decision that would change everything. I waited until 9 o'clock, when I knew my attorney's office would be open, and placed a call to Harrison Matthews, the lawyer who had been handling my family's legal affairs for over 20 years. Harrison was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, known for his discretion and expertise in estate planning. "Harrison," I said when he answered the phone, "I need to make some changes to my will immediately. Can you see me this afternoon?" "Of course, Margaret," Harrison replied, his voice reflecting concern at the urgency in my tone. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is about to be," I assured him. That afternoon, I drove to Harrison's office in the downtown district, a journey I had made many times over the years, but never with such determination and clarity of purpose. Harrison's office was exactly as I remembered it, lined with law books and decorated with photographs of his family and various legal achievements. "Margaret," Harrison said as he welcomed me into his office, "you sounded quite urgent on the phone. What can I do for you?" I sat down in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk and looked him directly in the eyes. "Harrison, I want to completely restructure my will. Everything that was previously designated for Robert needs to be redirected." Harrison's eyebrows raised slightly, but his professional demeanor remained intact. "That's certainly your prerogative, Margaret. May I ask what has prompted this decision?" I proceeded to tell him about the previous evening's dinner conversation, watching as his expression grew more serious with each detail. Harrison had known our family for decades and was well aware of the dynamics and relationships involved. "I see," Harrison said thoughtfully when I finished my account, "and you're absolutely certain about this course of action? These kinds of changes can have significant emotional and legal ramifications." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," I replied firmly. "I want Robert to receive exactly what he demonstrated he values about me last night. Nothing." Over the next 3 hours, Harrison and I worked together to completely restructure my estate plan. The house, the investments, the family heirlooms, the antique collections, everything that Robert and Sarah had been so eager to liquidate for their European adventure, would now be distributed in a way that I felt truly reflected my values and priorities. The largest portion of my estate would go to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting elderly individuals who had been abandoned or mistreated by their families. I had always been passionate about advocacy for senior citizens, having volunteered at local nursing homes and senior centers for many years. A significant amount would also go to Emma and Michael, Robert's children, but held in trust until they reached the age of 30. I wanted to ensure that they had opportunities for education and personal growth, but also that they would be mature enough to handle such responsibility wisely. Additionally, I designated substantial donations to several charities that had been close to my heart. The local animal shelter where I had volunteered, the library that Charles and I had supported for decades, and the hospital where I had recovered from my surgery 3 years prior. Harrison and I also established a fund for Jessica, Sarah's sister, who had always treated me with genuine kindness and respect. Unlike her sister, Jessica had never shown any indication that she viewed me as merely a financial opportunity. "There is one more thing, Harrison," I said as we were finalizing the documents. "I want to leave Robert exactly $1, along with a letter explaining my decision. I want there to be no question that this exclusion was intentional and not an oversight." Harrison nodded solemnly. "I understand, Margaret, and I want you to know that legally this will is airtight. Your mental capacity is clearly sound. You have legitimate reasons for your decisions, and everything has been properly documented and witnessed." We spent another hour reviewing every detail of the new will, ensuring that every contingency had been considered and every legal requirement had been met. When we finished, I felt a sense of peace and empowerment that I hadn't experienced in years. "Harrison," I said as I prepared to leave, "please keep this completely confidential. I don't want Robert or anyone else in the family to know about these changes until after I'm gone." "Of course, Margaret. Attorney-client privilege is absolute in these matters." As I drove home that afternoon, I felt as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I was looking forward to the future, knowing that my legacy would reflect my true values rather than simply enabling the callous opportunism I had witnessed the night before. Over the following weeks, I maintained my normal routine, but with a renewed sense of purpose and dignity. I continued to see Robert and his family regularly, but now I observed their interactions with me through a different lens. What I saw only confirmed that I had made the right decision. During one visit, I overheard Sarah on the phone with someone, presumably Patricia, discussing their European travel plans in great detail. She spoke about booking flights, researching hotels, and even learning basic Italian phrases, all while sitting in my living room and eating cookies I had baked for her children. Robert, meanwhile, had started making comments about the burden of maintaining such a large house and how much simpler things would be once I was no longer around to worry about it. Days, he even suggested that I consider moving to a smaller apartment or assisted living facility, ostensibly for my own convenience, but clearly motivated by his desire to access his inheritance sooner rather than later. But there were also unexpected developments that I hadn't anticipated when I made my decision to change the will. About a month after my visit to Harrison's office, I received a phone call that would add another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. "Mrs. Whitmore," said the voice on the other end of the line, "this is Detective Linda Rodriguez with the Fraud Investigation Unit. We need to speak with you about some financial irregularities involving your son's law firm." My heart sank as Detective Rodriguez explained that Robert was being investigated for embezzling client funds and falsifying legal documents. Apparently, several clients had filed complaints alleging that money from their settlement accounts had disappeared, and Robert's name had come up repeatedly in connection with these discrepancies. "We're not making any formal charges at this time," Detective Rodriguez assured me, "but we wanted to inform you because your son has listed you as a character reference, and we may need to speak with you as part of our investigation." After hanging up the phone, I sat in stunned silence. My son, the successful attorney I had been so proud of, was potentially a criminal who had been stealing from his own clients. It explained so much about his recent behavior, his increased interest in my estate, and his apparent financial stress, despite his supposedly successful career. I realized that Robert's eagerness to inherit my estate might not have been driven purely by greed and callousness, but also by desperation. If he was indeed guilty of embezzlement, he would likely face disbarment, criminal charges, and massive financial penalties. My inheritance would represent his only hope of avoiding complete financial ruin. This revelation added another dimension to my decision-making process. On one hand, I felt a maternal instinct to help my son in his time of need. On the other hand, I was horrified by the possibility that he had been stealing from people who had trusted him with their legal matters. I decided to call Harrison and discuss this new development. "Margaret," Harrison said when I explained the situation, "this certainly complicates things, but it doesn't necessarily change the fundamental issues that led you to modify your will in the first place." "But Harrison," I replied, "what if Robert really needs help? What if he's made mistakes but deserves a chance to make things right?" Harrison was quiet for a moment before responding. "Margaret, you've known your son for 45 years. Based on everything you've told me about his behavior, and now this new information, do you honestly believe that giving him access to your estate would help him become a better person, or would it simply enable him to continue making poor choices without facing consequences?" It was a difficult question, but deep down, I knew the answer. Robert had never shown genuine remorse for his treatment of me, never acknowledged that his comments about my death and his inheritance plans were hurtful and inappropriate. If anything, he had doubled down on his position, continuing to make insensitive remarks about my mortality and his financial expectations. "You're right, Harrison," I finally said. "If Robert is in legal trouble, that's something he needs to face and resolve on his own. Giving him my money won't teach him respect, responsibility, or basic human decency." As the weeks passed, more details about Robert's legal troubles began to emerge. He was indeed formally charged with embezzlement and fraud, and the local newspaper ran several articles about the scandal at his law firm. Sarah's reaction to these developments was particularly telling. Rather than standing by her husband and working together to address their legal and financial challenges, Sarah began making preparations to protect herself. I learned through Jessica that Sarah had consulted with a divorce attorney and was considering separating her finances from Robert's to avoid being held liable for his legal debts. During this turbulent time, I also began to see different sides of other family members that I hadn't fully appreciated before. Emma and Michael, despite being teenagers dealing with their parents' legal and marital problems, both reached out to me more frequently. Emma started visiting me every weekend, helping with household chores and simply spending time talking about her hopes and dreams for the future. "Grandma Margaret," Emma said during one of our conversations, "I'm really sorry about what Mom said at dinner that night. It wasn't right, and I want you to know that I don't think about you that way." Michael, who had always been quieter and more reserved, surprised me by asking if I would teach him how to tend the garden that Charles and I had cultivated together over the years. "I want to learn," he said simply, "so that I can keep it going after you're gone, to remember you by." These interactions with my grandchildren reminded me that family relationships are complex and that the sins of the parents are not necessarily inherited by their children. Emma and Michael were good kids who had been raised in an environment where their parents' values had perhaps not been the best influence, but they seemed to possess an innate sense of decency and respect that gave me hope for the future. Jessica also proved to be a source of unexpected support during this difficult time. Unlike her sister Sarah, who seemed primarily concerned with protecting herself from the fallout of Robert's legal troubles, Jessica reached out to me regularly to check on my well-being and offer assistance with anything I might need. "Margaret," Jessica said during one of our phone conversations, "I want you to know that not everyone in this family takes you for granted. Sarah has always been selfish, even when we were children, but that doesn't reflect how the rest of us feel about you." These positive interactions helped balance out the disappointment and hurt I felt about Robert and Sarah's behavior, but they also made me more confident that my decision to restructure my will had been the right one. The people who truly cared about me were demonstrating their affection through their actions, not their expectations of future financial benefit. As Robert's legal case proceeded through the court system, the family dynamics continued to shift in unexpected ways. Sarah did indeed file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, though everyone knew that her primary motivation was financial self-preservation. The divorce proceedings were contentious, with both parties fighting over assets and custody of Emma and Michael. During this time, Robert's desperation became increasingly apparent. His visits to my house became more frequent and more transparent in their purpose. Rather than coming to spend time with me or maintain our relationship, he would arrive with specific requests for financial assistance. "Mom," Robert said during one particularly uncomfortable visit, "I know things have been difficult lately, but I really need your help. The legal fees alone are going to bankrupt me, and if I lose the house, Emma and Michael won't have anywhere stable to live." I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved unconditionally for 45 years, and saw a stranger. The confident, successful attorney had been replaced by a desperate, manipulative individual who viewed me primarily as a source of financial rescue. "Robert," I replied calmly, "you're a grown man who made choices that led to these consequences. It's not my responsibility to bail you out of problems you created for yourself." "But I'm your son," Robert protested, his voice rising with frustration. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Being my son means a great deal to me," I answered, "which is why I'm so disappointed that you've shown so little respect for our relationship. The fact that you're my child doesn't obligate me to enable your poor decisions or shield you from the consequences of your actions." Robert stormed out of the house that day, and I didn't hear from him for several weeks. When he did contact me again, it was through a lawyer who sent a formal letter requesting that I provide financial assistance for Robert's legal defense, claiming that as his mother, I had a moral and potentially legal obligation to help him. Harrison was furious when I showed him the letter. "Margaret, this is nothing more than intimidation and manipulation. You have no legal obligation whatsoever to provide financial assistance to an adult child, particularly one who has been charged with criminal activity." The legal harassment from Robert's attorney continued for several months, with increasingly aggressive demands and threats. At one point, they even suggested that they might challenge my mental competency if I continued to refuse their requests for financial support. "Let them try," Harrison said with a slight smile when I expressed concern about this threat. "I have extensive documentation of our meetings and your decision-making process. Any competency challenge would be easily defeated and would likely result in sanctions against their attorney for frivolous litigation." As Robert's criminal trial approached, I found myself in the strange position of being subpoenaed to testify as a character witness for my own son. The prosecutor wanted me to speak about Robert's upbringing and family background, while Robert's defense attorney hoped I would provide testimony about his good character and family values. The trial itself was a surreal experience. Sitting in the courtroom, listening to evidence about my son's criminal behavior was one of the most difficult things I had ever endured. The prosecution presented a compelling case that Robert had systematically stolen money from client accounts over a period of several years, using sophisticated methods to hide his activities and falsify records. When I was called to testify, Both attorneys asked me questions about Robert's character, his upbringing, and his relationship with our family. I answered honestly, describing the son I had raised and loved, but also acknowledging that I had been disappointed by some of his recent behavior and choices. Robert was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay substantial restitution to his victims. The judge also ordered him to surrender his law license permanently and prohibited him from working in any fiduciary capacity in the future. After the sentencing, Sarah approached me outside the courthouse. She looked haggard and defeated, having lost her husband to prison and her financial security, to divorce proceedings and legal fees. "Margaret," Sarah said, her voice lacking the confidence and arrogance I had become accustomed to, "I know things have been difficult between us, but Robert and I are both going to need help getting through this. The kids need stability, and I don't know how I'm going to manage on my own." I looked at this woman who had so casually discussed my death and her plans to liquidate my life's work, and I felt a mixture of pity and vindication. "Sarah," I replied, "you made it very clear how you viewed me and what you expected from our family relationship. I'm sorry that things haven't worked out the way you planned, but you'll need to find your own way forward." With Robert in prison and Sarah struggling to rebuild her life as a single mother, the family dynamic shifted once again. Emma and Michael were spending more time with me, partly because Sarah was working multiple jobs to make ends meet, and partly because they seemed to genuinely enjoy our relationship. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, had grown into a thoughtful and mature young woman. She often asked me about my life experiences, my relationship with her grandfather Charles, and my thoughts about family, love, and responsibility. "Grandma Margaret," Emma said one afternoon as we were working together in the garden, "I want you to know that I understand why you were hurt by what my parents said and did. I'm embarrassed by their behavior, and I hope you don't think that Michael and I share their values." "Emma," I replied, "I've always known that you and your brother are good people with kind hearts. What happened with your parents doesn't change how I feel about either of you." Michael, now 16 and dealing with the typical challenges of adolescence complicated by his father's imprisonment, had become increasingly interested in learning about our family history. He spent hours listening to my stories about Charles, about the early days of our marriage, and about the traditions and values that had shaped our family for generations. "Grandma," Michael asked during one of our conversations, "do you think Dad always was the kind of person who would steal from people, or did something change him along the way?" It was a profound question that I had been wrestling with myself. "Michael," I said carefully, "I think your father lost sight of what really matters in life. He became so focused on money and status and appearances that he forgot about integrity, honesty, and treating other people with respect." As Emma's 18th birthday approached, she received several college acceptance letters, including offers from prestigious schools that would require significant financial resources. Sarah came to me one evening, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. "Margaret," Sarah said, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything after the way I've behaved, but Emma has been accepted to some amazing schools, and I simply can't afford to send her. She's worked so hard and deserves these opportunities, but without Robert's income and with all the legal debts, I just don't see how it's possible." I had been expecting this conversation and had already given considerable thought to how I would respond. "Sarah," I said, "Emma's education is important to me, and I don't want her to suffer because of choices that you and Robert made. However, I'm not going to simply write checks to solve problems that you've created." I explained to Sarah that I had established an educational trust fund for Emma and Michael that would cover their college expenses, but only if they maintained good grades, demonstrated good character, and showed respect for family values and relationships. "The money will be administered by a trustee," I continued, "and will be paid directly to the educational institutions." This ensures that the funds will be used for their intended purpose and removes any temptation for anyone to use the money for other purposes. Sarah's relief was visible, but she also seemed frustrated by the conditions and restrictions I had imposed. "Margaret," she said, "I appreciate your generosity, but don't you think these conditions are a bit excessive? Emma and Michael are good kids." "Yes, they are good kids," I agreed, "which is exactly why I want to make sure they stay that way. The conditions I've established are designed to encourage them to continue making good choices and to understand that privileges come with responsibilities." Over the next several months, as Emma prepared for college and Michael continued his high school studies, I found myself developing an even closer relationship with both of them. They both seemed to understand and appreciate the lessons I was trying to teach them about character, integrity, and the importance of treating other people with respect. Emma decided to study social work, inspired partly by her experiences with her father's legal troubles and partly by her observations of how I had handled the family crisis with dignity and strength. Michael became interested in environmental conservation, spending increasing amounts of time working in the garden and learning about sustainable living practices. Meanwhile, Robert's situation in prison was not going well. He had apparently expected that his incarceration would be a brief inconvenience that would be resolved through appeals or early release for good behavior. Instead, he was discovering that prison life was harsh and that his fellow inmates had little sympathy for a lawyer who had stolen from his clients. Sarah began visiting Robert regularly, despite their divorce proceedings, and she often provided me with updates about his condition and his repeated requests for financial assistance. According to Sarah, Robert was convinced that if he could hire better attorneys for his appeals, he could get his conviction overturned or his sentence reduced. "He keeps asking if you'll help pay for the appeal," Sarah told me during one of her visits. "He says that as his mother, you should want to help him clear his name and get back to his life." "Sarah," I replied, "Robert was convicted by a jury of his peers after a fair trial with competent legal representation. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Spending more money on appeals attorneys isn't going to change the facts of what he did." As time passed, I began to notice changes in my own health that reminded me that my time on earth was indeed limited, though perhaps not as immediately limited as Robert and Sarah had hoped. I was diagnosed with early-stage heart disease, requiring medication and lifestyle changes, but nothing that represented an immediate threat to my life. The diagnosis prompted me to reflect once again on my estate planning decisions and to consider whether any modifications might be appropriate. I arranged another meeting with Harrison to review my will and ensure that everything was still structured according to my wishes. "Harrison," I said during our meeting, "I want to make sure that if anything happens to me, Emma and Michael will have access to more than just their educational funds. They've both proven themselves to be exceptional young people, and I want them to have the resources they need to build meaningful lives." Drasus, we modified the trust provisions to provide Emma and Michael with additional support for starting their careers, purchasing homes, and eventually starting families of their own. The conditions remained in place regarding good character and responsible behavior, but the amounts available were increased significantly. "What about Robert?" Harrison asked. "Are you still comfortable with leaving him only the symbolic $1? I considered the question carefully. Robert had been in prison for over a year and had not shown any signs of genuine remorse or self-reflection. His communications with the family continued to focus primarily on his desire for financial assistance and his conviction that he had been unfairly treated by the legal system. "Harrison," I said finally, "Robert has had multiple opportunities to demonstrate that he understands the impact of his actions and that he's committed to making better choices in the future. Instead, he continues to view himself as a victim and to expect other people to solve his problems for him. I see no reason to change my decision regarding his inheritance." As my 84th birthday approached, I decided to host a small family celebration, inviting Emma, Michael, Jessica, and her family, but not extending an invitation to Sarah. It wasn't meant as a deliberate slight, but rather a reflection of the natural evolution of our family relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The birthday celebration was one of the most enjoyable family gatherings I had experienced in years. Emma shared stories about her college experiences and her plans for graduate school in social work. Michael talked about his environmental projects and his ideas for making the family property more sustainable and eco-friendly. Jessica and her family were warm and engaging, treating me with the kind of respect and affection that I had always hoped to receive from all my family members. Her children, who were younger than Emma and Michael, listened attentively to my stories and seemed genuinely interested in learning about their family history. "Aunt Margaret," said Jessica's daughter Caroline, who was 10 years old, "will you teach me how to make your famous chocolate chip cookies? Mum says they're the best she's ever tasted." "Of course, sweetie," I replied. "But first, let me tell you the secret ingredient that makes them so special." "What is it?" Caroline asked with wide-eyed curiosity. "Love," I said with a smile. "The secret ingredient is always love." After the other guests had gone home, Emma and Michael stayed behind to help clean up and spend a little more time with me. As we worked together in the kitchen, washing dishes and putting away leftovers, I felt a profound sense of contentment and gratitude. "Grandma Margaret," Emma said as she dried the crystal glasses, "I want you to know how much these times with you mean to me. I've learned more about life and values from you than from anyone else in my family." Michael nodded in agreement. "You've always treated us with respect and kindness, even when other people in the family haven't behaved very well. That means a lot to us." Later that evening, as I sat alone in my favorite chair by the fireplace, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 2 years earlier, I'd been devastated by my son's callous attitude toward my mortality and his greedy anticipation of my death. But through the process of taking control of my own legacy and making difficult but necessary decisions, I had discovered strength and purpose that I hadn't known I possessed. The phone rang, interrupting my reverie. It was Sarah, calling from the prison where she had been visiting Robert. "Margaret," Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration, "Robert is really struggling in there. He's been attacked twice by other inmates, and he's becoming increasingly depressed. The doctor says he's showing signs of serious mental health issues." "I'm sorry to hear that Robert is having difficulties," I replied, "but I'm not sure why you're calling to tell me this." "Because he's your son," Sarah exclaimed. "Don't you care what happens to him?" "Of course I care about Robert," I said calmly. "But caring about someone doesn't mean that you're obligated to rescue them from the consequences of their own choices. Robert is an adult who made decisions that harmed other people, and now he's facing the results of those decisions." Sarah was quiet for a moment before continuing. "Margaret, I know you're angry about what we said that night at dinner, but don't you think Robert has suffered enough? Don't you think it's time to forgive and help him get his life back together?" It was a question that I had been expecting, and I had thought carefully about my response. "Sarah," I said, "forgiveness is about letting go of anger and resentment for your own peace of mind. I have forgiven Robert for the hurt he caused me, but forgiveness doesn't mean that I'm required to enable his behavior or shield him from consequences. Robert needs to learn how to take responsibility for his actions and how to rebuild his life based on better values and choices." After hanging up the phone, I realized that this conversation with Sarah had crystallized something important for me. My decision to change my will had never been primarily about punishment or revenge, although it had certainly been prompted by anger and hurt. Instead, it had been about establishing boundaries and teaching lessons about respect, responsibility, and the consequences of treating other people poorly. A few months later, I received another phone call that would add yet another layer of complexity to the family situation. It was from a woman named Linda Peterson, who identified herself as a paralegal at Robert's former law firm. "Mrs. Whitmore," Linda said, I'm calling because we've discovered some additional information about your son's activities that we thought you should know about. Linda explained that during the process of reviewing Robert's cases and financial records, they had discovered that he had also been falsifying documents and overcharging clients for services that were never performed. The scope of his fraudulent activities was far more extensive than had been revealed during his criminal trial. We're in the process of notifying additional victims, Linda continued, and we wanted to let you know that several of these victims have expressed interest in pursuing civil lawsuits against Robert and potentially against his family members for recovery of damages. This news was deeply troubling on multiple levels. Not only did it confirm that Robert's criminal behavior had been even more extensive than I had realized, but it also raised the possibility that Emma and Michael could be affected by civil litigation against their father. I immediately called Harrison to discuss this development and its potential implications for my estate planning. "Margaret," Harrison said after I explained the situation, "this information actually strengthens the case for the decisions you've made regarding your will. If Robert's legal troubles are more extensive than we previously understood, then providing him with access to your estate would likely just result in those assets being seized to pay judgments to his victims." Harrison also pointed out that by establishing trust funds for Emma and Michael that were completely separate from Robert's financial situation, I had actually protected my grandchildren from potential claims against their father's assets. This revelation about the full extent of Robert's criminal activities was emotionally devastating for me. I had always known that Robert had made serious mistakes, but learning that his fraudulent behavior had harmed even more people than originally understood was heartbreaking. Emma and Michael were also deeply affected by this news. Emma, who was now in her second year of college, called me in tears after learning about the additional charges against her father. "Grandma Margaret," Emma sobbed into the phone. "How could he have done this to so many people? How could he have lied and stolen from people who trusted him?" "Emma," I said gently, "I wish I had answers for you, but I don't understand your father's behavior any better than you do. What I do know is that you are not responsible for his choices, and you don't have to carry the burden of his mistakes." Michael's reaction was different, but equally intense. Rather than sadness, he seemed to experience anger and a sense of betrayal. "I don't want to have anything to do with him anymore," Michael told me during one of our weekend visits. "He's embarrassed our whole family, and I don't want people to think I'm like him." These reactions from Emma and Michael reinforced my belief that I had made the right decisions regarding my estate planning. Both of them were demonstrating exactly the kind of moral clarity and personal integrity that I hope to encourage through the structure of their trust funds. As Robert's third year in prison began, Sarah's financial situation had become increasingly desperate. The combination of legal fees, restitution payments, and the loss of Robert's income had forced her to sell their family home and move into a small apartment. She had taken a job as a retail manager, a significant step down from the comfortable lifestyle she had enjoyed as the wife of a successful attorney. During this time, Sarah's attitude toward me underwent a dramatic transformation. Gone was the arrogant, dismissive woman who had casually discussed my death over dinner. In her place was someone who seemed genuinely humbled by her circumstances and apparently grateful for any assistance or kindness I might offer. "Margaret," Sarah said during one of her increasingly frequent visits, "I want to apologize for the terrible things I said that night at dinner. I was thoughtless and cruel, and I understand now how much I hurt you." I studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated manipulation. "Sarah," I replied carefully, "I appreciate your apology, but I hope you understand that words alone aren't enough to rebuild trust that has been broken." "I know," Sarah said, her eyes filling with tears. "I know I have to prove that I've changed, that I've learned from my mistakes. I just hope you'll give me that chance." Over the following months, Sarah did indeed seem to make an effort to demonstrate that her apology was sincere. She began helping with household tasks when she visited, showed genuine interest in my well-being, and stopped making any references to financial assistance or inheritance expectations. However, I remained cautious about Sarah's motivations. Her transformation had coincided perfectly with her desperate financial circumstances, making it difficult to determine whether her changed behavior reflected genuine personal growth or simply strategic adaptation to her new reality. Meanwhile, Emma had decided to spend her summer vacation working at a non-profit organization that provided legal assistance to low-income families who had been victims of fraud. When she told me about her choice, I couldn't help but see the irony and the potential for redemption in her decision. "I want to help people who have been hurt the way my father hurt his clients," Emma explained. "I can't undo what he did, but maybe I can make a small difference for other families who are dealing with similar situations." Michael had also found constructive ways to channel his emotions about his father's crimes. He had started a recycling and environmental conservation program at his high school, and he spent his weekends organizing community cleanup projects and educating younger students about environmental responsibility. "Grandma Margaret," Michael told me, "I've decided that I want to study environmental law in college. I want to use the legal system to protect people and the environment, not to hurt them like my father did." These positive developments with Emma and Michael provided bright spots during what continued to be a difficult period for our family. Both of them seemed determined to create identities for themselves that were defined by their own values and choices, rather than by their father's criminal behavior. As my 85th birthday approached, I received an unexpected phone call that would bring yet another dramatic turn to our family's story. The caller identified himself as Detective Michael Chen from the state prison where Robert was being held. "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Chen said, "I'm calling to inform you that your son has been involved in a serious incident here at the facility. He's been hospitalized with significant injuries." My heart raced as Detective Chen explained that Robert had been attacked by several inmates who had discovered that he was a lawyer who had stolen from clients. Apparently, the prison population had a particular hatred for attorneys who had betrayed their professional responsibilities, and Robert had become a target for violence. "Is he going to survive?" I asked, my maternal instincts overriding my anger and disappointment. "He's in critical condition," Detective Chen replied, "but the doctors believe he will recover. However, he's requesting to see you, and he's indicated that he has something important he wants to discuss." I found myself in an emotional dilemma that I had never anticipated. Despite everything that Robert had done, despite the hurt he had caused and the disappointment he represented, he was still my son, and he was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life. After much internal struggle, I decided to visit Robert in the prison hospital. I called Emma and Michael to let them know about their father's condition, and both of them asked if they could accompany me. Sarah, when informed, broke down completely and begged to come along as well. The drive to the state prison was one of the most emotionally challenging experiences of my life. Emma sat beside me in the passenger seat, holding my hand and providing quiet support. Michael was in the back seat with Sarah, who alternated between sobbing and expressing guilt about her role in the family's destruction. When we arrived at the prison hospital, we were met by Detective Chen and a prison chaplain named Father Williams. They explained that Robert's injuries were severe but not life-threatening, and that he had specifically requested to see me alone before speaking with other family members. Walking into that stark, sterile hospital room and seeing my son lying there with bandages covering much of his face and upper body was almost more than I could bear. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite all the anger and disappointment, seeing him in such a vulnerable state reminded me of the little boy I had raised and loved unconditionally. "Mum," Robert whispered when he saw me, his voice barely audible through his swollen lips. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I sat down in the chair beside his bed and looked at this broken man who was my child. "Robert," I said gently. "Regardless of what has happened between us, I would never ignore you when you're hurt and in need." For the next hour, Robert spoke more honestly and openly than he had in years. He acknowledged the full extent of his criminal behavior, expressed genuine remorse for the harm he had caused to his victims, and admitted that his treatment of me had been inexcusable. "Mom," Robert said, tears streaming down his bruised face, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand now how wrong I was about everything. I was so focused on money and status that I lost sight of what really matters. I became someone I don't even recognize." "Robert," I replied, "I forgave you a long time ago. Forgiveness isn't something you have to earn. It's something I chose to give myself so that I could find peace." But Mom," Robert continued, "I know about the will. I know you've changed everything, and I want you to know that you made the right decision. I don't deserve your inheritance, and I hope that Emma and Michael understand why you made the choices you did." This admission surprised me. "How did you find out about the will changes?" I asked. Robert explained that Sarah had told him about her conversations with Harrison's office, where she had been trying to get information about my estate planning. Apparently, while Harrison had maintained strict confidentiality about the specific details, Sarah had been able to infer from his responses that significant changes had been made. "I'm glad you changed the will," Robert said. "I'm glad you didn't let my behavior and Sarah's greed affect Emma and Michael's futures. They're good kids, and they deserve better than what Sarah and I have given them." This conversation with Robert in the prison hospital marked a turning point in our relationship. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my son rather than to a stranger who happened to share my DNA. His brush with death and his experience of serious physical violence seemed to have broken through the layers of selfishness and entitlement that had characterized his behavior for so long. Over the following weeks, as Robert recovered from his injuries, our family began to rebuild some of the connections that had been damaged by his criminal behavior and the subsequent legal proceedings. Emma and Michael started visiting their father regularly, and they reported that he seemed genuinely committed to understanding and addressing the character flaws that had led to his downfall. Sarah, too, seemed to benefit from Robert's changed perspective. During their conversations, Robert apparently acknowledged his role in encouraging her materialistic and selfish attitudes, and he urged her to focus on being a better mother to Emma and Michael, rather than pursuing financial gain. As Robert's release date approached, still more than a year away, our family began discussing what his reintegration into society might look like. He would be prohibited from practicing law, and his criminal record would make finding employment extremely difficult. Additionally, he would face ongoing financial obligations related to restitution payments to his victims. "Mom," Robert said during one of my visits, "I know I can't expect you to support me financially when I get out of prison, but I'm hoping you might help me in other ways. I want to find work where I can make a positive contribution, maybe helping other people who have made mistakes learn from their experiences." This request represented a significant departure from Robert's previous expectations of financial rescue, and it suggested that his personal transformation might be genuine rather than merely strategic. Meanwhile, Emma had graduated from college with honors and had been accepted into a prestigious graduate program in social work. Her experiences with her father's crimes and their impact on victims had shaped her career goals, and she was particularly interested in working with families affected by white-collar crime. Michael had also continued to excel academically and had been accepted into several top-tier universities with programs in environmental law. His passion for environmental protection had grown stronger over the years, and he often spoke about his desire to use legal tools to combat climate change and protect natural resources. Both Emma and Michael had developed into remarkable young adults with strong moral compasses and clear senses of purpose. Their ability to overcome the trauma and embarrassment of their father's criminal behavior while maintaining their integrity and compassion was a source of tremendous pride for me. As I approached my 86th birthday, I began to experience more serious health problems that reminded me that my time was indeed limited. I was diagnosed with a more aggressive form of heart disease that would require surgery, and my doctors warned me that my recovery would be lengthy and uncertain. This health scare prompted me to have another conversation with Harrison about my estate planning and to ensure that all my affairs were in order. We reviewed every aspect of my will and the various trust funds I had established, confirming that everything was structured according to my wishes and that all contingencies had been addressed. "Harrison," I said during what I knew might be one of our final meetings, "I want you to know how grateful I am for your guidance and support through all of this. You've helped me ensure that my legacy will reflect my values rather than simply enabling poor behavior." "Margaret," Harrison replied, "it has been an honor to work with you. Your strength and wisdom throughout this entire ordeal have been truly inspiring." The heart surgery was scheduled for early December, and I spent the weeks leading up to it making sure that everything in my life was properly organized. I wrote letters to Emma and Michael explaining my love for them and my hopes for their futures. I also wrote a letter to Robert, expressing my forgiveness and my belief that he could rebuild his life based on better principles. I even wrote a letter to Sarah, acknowledging that despite our differences and the hurt she had caused, I recognized that she was trying to become a better person and a better mother to her children. The night before my surgery, Emma and Michael stayed with me at the house, and we spent the evening looking through old photo albums and sharing memories of happier times when our family had been whole and harmonious. "Grandma Margaret," Emma said as we sat together on the sofa, "no matter what happens with the surgery, I want you to know that you've taught me everything important about how to live a good life. You've shown me what it means to have integrity and strength and compassion." Michael nodded in agreement. "You've been the best role model anyone could ask for. Even when everything was falling apart with Mom and Dad, you never lost your dignity or your kindness." The surgery itself was more complicated than the doctors had anticipated, and my recovery was slow and difficult. For several weeks, I was in intensive care, drifting in and out of consciousness and unable to communicate effectively with my family. During this time, Emma and Michael maintained a constant vigil by my bedside, taking turns reading to me, playing my favorite music, and simply holding my hand. Sarah also visited regularly, and she seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being rather than motivated by any financial considerations. Even Robert, despite being in prison and facing significant obstacles to visiting, managed to send letters and messages through Sarah, expressing his love and concern for my recovery. When I finally regained full consciousness and began to recover my strength, I was deeply moved by the love and support that my family had shown during my most vulnerable time. It confirmed that despite all the difficulties and conflicts we had experienced, the fundamental bonds of family love and connection remained strong. As I continued to recover over the following months, I had plenty of time to reflect on the journey that had brought me to this point. What had started as a devastating betrayal by my son and daughter-in-law had ultimately led to a transformation of our entire family's understanding of what really matters in life. Robert's criminal behavior and imprisonment had been traumatic for everyone, but it had also created opportunities for growth and redemption that might not have existed otherwise. Emma and Michael had developed strength and character that would serve them well throughout their lives. Even Sarah seemed to have gained perspective and humility that had been lacking in her earlier behavior. And I had discovered that taking control of my own legacy and refusing to enable poor behavior had actually strengthened rather than weakened the family relationships that mattered most to me. By the time of my 87th birthday, I was well enough to host a small family celebration again. This time, the gathering included Emma and Michael, Sarah, Jessica and her family, and even Robert, who had been granted special permission to attend under prison supervision. Seeing Robert in his prison uniform, accompanied by guards, was a stark reminder of how far our family had fallen and how much work remained to be done. But seeing him interact with Emma and Michael with genuine love and respect, and watching him listen carefully to their stories about their academic and personal achievements, gave me hope that our family might eventually heal from the wounds that his behavior had created. During the birthday celebration, Emma announced that she had been offered a position with a prestigious law firm that specialized in representing victims of white-collar crime. She would be working directly with families who had been hurt by criminals like her father, helping them navigate the legal system and recover damages. Michael announced that he had decided to accept a scholarship to study environmental law at a top university, and that he planned to spend his summer internship working with an organization that prosecuted environmental crimes. These announcements filled me with pride and confirmed that my decision to restructure my estate in their favor had been wise. Both Emma and Michael were choosing career paths that would allow them to make positive contributions to society, while also honoring the lessons they had learned from their family's difficulties. As the evening wound down and Robert was preparing to return to prison, he asked if he could speak with me privately for a few minutes. "Mom," Robert said, "I want you to know that seeing Emma and Michael tonight, hearing about their accomplishments and their plans for the future, has given me more hope than I've had in years. They're going to be amazing adults, and they're going to make contributions to the world that will more than make up for the harm I've caused." "Robert," I replied, "Emma and Michael are remarkable people, but they're remarkable because of their own choices and character, not because they need to compensate for your mistakes. You can't undo the past, but you can still build a future based on better principles." "I know," Robert said, "and I want you to know that when I get out of prison, I'm not going to ask you for money or expect you to solve my problems. I'm going to find my own way, and I'm going to try to make whatever contributions I can to help other people avoid the mistakes I made." This conversation with Robert represented the completion of a circle that had begun 3 years earlier with his cruel laughter about my death and his plans to liquidate my life's work. The man who was speaking to me now bore little resemblance to the selfish, entitled person who had hurt me so deeply that night at dinner. A few months later, I received a phone call that I'd been both expecting and dreading. It was from Detective Chen, informing me that Robert had been involved in another incident at the prison, but this time as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Robert had intervened to protect a younger inmate who was being sexually assaulted by a group of older prisoners. In the process, Robert had been severely beaten and stabbed multiple times. He was once again in the prison hospital, and his condition was critical. This time, when I visited Robert in the hospital, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years: peace. Despite his physical pain and the uncertainty of his prognosis, Robert seemed calm and centered in a way that reminded me of the boy I had raised. "Mom," Robert said, his voice weak but clear, "I know this might sound strange, but I'm not afraid. For the first time in years, I feel like I did the right thing. I couldn't just stand by and watch someone else get hurt when I had the power to help." "Robert," I said, tears streaming down my face, "I am so proud of you. What you did required real courage and character." Robert's recovery from this second assault was much more difficult than his recovery from the first. The stab wounds had caused significant internal damage, and he required multiple surgeries. For several weeks, his survival was uncertain. During this time, our entire family rallied around Robert in a way that would have been impossible during the earlier stages of his imprisonment. Emma and Michael visited as often as the prison regulations allowed. Sarah coordinated with doctors and advocated for Robert's medical care. Even Jessica and her family sent cards and messages of support. The prison chaplain, Father Williams, told me that Robert's intervention to protect the younger inmate had earned him respect among both the prison staff and many of the other inmates. His reputation had transformed from that of a despised white-collar criminal to that of someone who was willing to sacrifice his own safety to protect others. When Robert finally recovered enough to return to the general prison population, he discovered that his status within the prison community had changed dramatically. Rather than being a target for violence, he was now viewed as someone with integrity and courage. "Mom," Robert told me during one of my visits, "I never expected that some of the most important lessons about character and courage would come from being in prison, but that's what has happened. I've learned things here that I never learned in law school or in my professional career." Robert began working with the prison chaplain to develop programs for other inmates who were struggling with guilt and shame about their crimes. He also started teaching basic legal literacy classes, helping fellow prisoners understand their rights and navigate the appeals process. These activities gave Robert a sense of purpose that he had been lacking since his conviction, and they seemed to accelerate his personal transformation. The selfish, entitled person who had entered prison 3 years earlier was being replaced by someone who was genuinely committed to helping others and making positive contributions wherever possible. As Robert's release date finally approached, our family began making concrete plans for his reintegration into society. Emma and Michael had both expressed their desire to help their father rebuild his life, but they had also made it clear that their support was conditional on his continued commitment to positive behavior and personal growth. Sarah had also evolved considerably during Robert's imprisonment. She had established a stable life for herself and had demonstrated genuine personal growth and maturity. While she and Robert would not be reuniting as a married couple, they had developed a respectful, co-parenting relationship focused on supporting Emma and Michael. "Margaret," Sarah said during one of our conversations about Robert's impending release, "I want you to know how grateful I am for the way you've handled this entire situation. You had every right to turn your back on all of us, but instead you've shown us what it means to have real strength and character." As my 88th birthday approached, I began to feel a sense of completion and satisfaction about the way my life had unfolded. The crisis that had begun with Robert and Sarah's callous discussion of my death had ultimately led to profound positive changes in our family's dynamics and values. Emma had graduated from her master's program and was working as a victim advocate with a highly respected legal aid organization. Her work was challenging but deeply meaningful, and she often told me how much she valued the opportunity to help families who had been harmed by crimes similar to her father's. Michael had completed his undergraduate degree with highest honors and had been accepted into law school with a full scholarship. His focus on environmental law had sharpened, and he had already been selected for prestigious internships with organizations that worked on climate change litigation. Even Robert's transformation had exceeded my most optimistic expectations. His willingness to risk his own safety to protect another person had demonstrated that his personal growth was genuine and profound rather than merely strategic. The day before Robert's release from prison, I had one final conversation with Harrison about my estate planning. By this time, Harrison was in his 70s and had become more than just my attorney. He was a trusted friend who had guided me through one of the most difficult periods of my life. "Margaret," Harrison said, "you've created something remarkable here. Your decision to restructure your will wasn't just about money. It was about teaching lessons and encouraging better behavior. The results speak for themselves." "Harrison," I replied, "I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their poor choices. If I had simply left everything to Robert as originally planned, none of these positive changes would have occurred." Robert was released from prison on a sunny morning in late spring. Emma, Michael, and I were there to meet him, along with Sarah and Jessica's family. Seeing Robert walk out of that prison as a free man was an emotional moment that I had wondered if I would live to see. The man who emerged from prison bore little resemblance to the arrogant, selfish person who had entered it 4 years earlier. Robert looked older and more weathered, but he also carried himself with a quiet dignity and humility that had been completely absent from his earlier behavior. "Mom," Robert said as he embraced me, "thank you for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." Over the following months, Robert worked diligently to rebuild his life based on the lessons he had learned during his imprisonment. He found employment with a non-profit organization that provided job training and support services to formerly incarcerated individuals. The work was challenging and poorly paid compared to his previous career, but Robert approached it with enthusiasm and dedication. "I may never have the kind of financial success I had before," Robert told me during one of our regular Sunday dinners, "but I have something now that I never had then, the knowledge that I'm making a positive difference in other people's lives." Robert also began making payments toward the restitution he owed to his victims, even though the amounts were small given his limited income. He had contacted each of his victims personally to apologize for his crimes and to express his commitment to making whatever amends were possible. These efforts at restitution and reconciliation were not legally required, but Robert felt they were morally necessary. Several of his victims had actually written letters expressing their appreciation for his genuine remorse and his efforts to take responsibility for his actions. As I celebrated my 89th birthday, surrounded by my family in the same dining room where the crisis had begun 5 years earlier, I reflected on the remarkable journey we had all traveled together. The cruel words that Sarah had spoken about my death and their plans to liquidate my legacy had ultimately led to profound positive changes that none of us could have anticipated. Emma was now a senior advocate at her legal aid organization and was being considered for a promotion to a leadership position. She had also become engaged to a wonderful young man named David, who shared her commitment to social justice and helping others. Michael was in his second year of law school and had been selected for a summer internship with the Environmental Protection Agency. His professors consistently praised his dedication and his innovative approaches to environmental legal challenges. Robert had been promoted to a supervisory position at the non-profit organization where he worked, and he was developing new programs to help formerly incarcerated individuals transition successfully back into society. He had also begun speaking at high schools and colleges about the consequences of white-collar crime and the importance of ethical decision-making. Even Sarah had continued to grow and evolve. She had been promoted to a management position at her retail job and had started taking night classes to complete her college degree. She had also begun volunteering with organizations that supported families affected by incarceration. The transformation of our family had been neither quick nor easy, but it had been profound and lasting. The crisis that had threatened to destroy us had ultimately made us stronger and more connected to our fundamental values. During that 89th birthday celebration, Emma stood up to make a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Grandma Margaret," Emma said, raising her glass, "5 years ago, we were a family that had lost its way. We had forgotten what really matters and had become focused on all the wrong things, but you showed us through your strength and wisdom what it means to have real character and integrity. You refused to enable our worst impulses, and instead you challenged us to become better people. Every good thing that has happened to our family since then can be traced back to the courage you showed in standing up for your values." As I looked around the table at these remarkable people who were my family, I felt a deep sense of gratitude and accomplishment. The decision I had made to change my will had been born out of hurt and anger, but it had ultimately led to healing and redemption that I could never have imagined. 2 days later, Harrison called with news that would add one final chapter to our family's story. "Margaret," Harrison said, "I've received a call from the attorney representing one of Robert's victims, a widow named Helen Morrison, whose retirement savings Robert had stolen. She wants to meet with you." I agreed to the meeting. curious about what Mrs. Morrison might want to discuss. When she arrived at my house the following week, I was struck by her dignity and grace. She was a woman about my age who had clearly faced significant hardships with remarkable strength. "Mrs. Whitmore," Helen Morrison said, "I wanted to meet you because your son has become a very important person in my life, though not in the way you might expect." Mrs. Morrison explained that Robert had been working with her through the non-profit organization to help her rebuild her financial security after losing her retirement savings to his crimes. But more than that, he had become a source of emotional support and practical assistance during one of the most difficult periods of her life. "Your son has spent countless hours helping me understand the legal system, connecting me with resources, and simply being someone who listens when I need to talk about how his crimes affected my life," Mrs. Morrison continued. "He has shown me a level of genuine remorse and commitment to making amends that I never expected from someone who had hurt me so deeply." Mrs. Morrison went on to tell me that Robert had been instrumental in helping her secure new housing when she was facing eviction, and that he had connected her with job training programs that had allowed her to find employment despite her age. "Mrs. Whitmore," Helen Morrison said, "I came here today to tell you that you should be proud of the man your son has become. He can never give me back the retirement I had planned or undo the stress and fear his crimes caused me, but he has shown me that people can change and that redemption is possible." This conversation with Helen Morrison provided a perfect conclusion to the long journey our family had traveled together. The man who had once stolen from vulnerable people was now dedicating his life to helping those same populations rebuild and recover. As I write this account of our family's transformation, I am 90 years old and in failing health. The doctors have told me that I have only a few months left to live, but I face this final chapter of my life with peace and contentment. My decision to change my will 5 years ago was one of the most difficult and important decisions I ever made. It was motivated initially by hurt and anger, but it ultimately led to healing and redemption that exceeded my wildest dreams. Emma and Michael have grown into remarkable adults who will use their inheritances to continue making positive contributions to the world. Robert has demonstrated that people can change and that it's never too late to choose a better path. Even Sarah has found her way to a more meaningful and principled life. The foundation I established for elderly individuals who have been mistreated by their families is now helping hundreds of people maintain their dignity and independence. The charitable donations I designated are supporting causes that have been important to me throughout my life. Most importantly, our family has learned that love sometimes requires tough decisions, and that enabling poor behavior is not actually an act of kindness. We have discovered that consequences, when applied with wisdom and consistency, can be powerful teachers that lead to positive change. When that lawyer calls tomorrow to confirm that my will changes were intentional, I will smile and say yes, just as I have for the past 5 years. But now I know that my decision was about much more than inheritance or money. It was about teaching lessons, encouraging growth, and ultimately healing relationships that had been damaged by greed, selfishness, and disrespect. The people who once viewed my death as a financial opportunity have learned to value our relationships for reasons that have nothing to do with money. They have discovered the satisfaction that comes from earning respect through character and actions rather than expecting it as an entitlement. As I prepare for my final journey, I am surrounded by family members who love me for who I am rather than what I can give them. I'm leaving behind a legacy that reflects my values and will continue to make positive contributions long after I am gone. The cruel laughter that once wounded me so deeply has been replaced by genuine love, respect, and gratitude. The European vacation that Sarah once planned to fund with the proceeds from my death has been forgotten, replaced by more meaningful dreams and aspirations. In the end, the best revenge was not revenge at all, but rather the patient work of teaching better values and encouraging personal growth. The greatest victory was not in punishing those who had hurt me, but in helping them become better people who would never hurt anyone else in the same way. And so, as I close this final chapter of my life, I do so with the knowledge that my story will continue through the lives of those I leave behind. Emma will continue fighting for justice and helping victims rebuild their lives. Michael will work to protect our environment for future generations. Robert will continue helping other people learn from their mistakes and build better lives. The foundation I established will provide dignity and support for elderly individuals who need advocates and protection. The charities I have supported will continue their important work long after my name is forgotten. This is the legacy I choose to leave. Not just money or property, but values, lessons, and the knowledge that people can change, families can heal, and love ultimately triumphs over greed, selfishness, and cruelty. The laughter has stopped, the tears have dried, and what remains is love, respect, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and a family well taught.